I'm Shemaya. It's like papaya, except it's not. And this is Plot Twist Please. Today, I thought I'd chat about treating your heart like a palace. Now, someone gave me an analogy a long time ago that was, if someone is in the living room who doesn't belong in the living room, put them in the foyer. And so, if we're looking at how a house is constructed, we're looking at the porch, the front door, the foyer, the hallway, the living room, the kitchen, and upstairs. Now, everyone doesn't belong upstairs. We know that. Some people don't even belong inside the house at all. And that's okay. Now, as someone who is inclined to show empathy, I find that people like me, including myself, have issues setting boundaries for ourselves, for how much we want to give and how much space we want to offer up. And that's a pretty common issue that I find. It's funny too, because one of the misconceptions about autism, and if you don't know, I'm autistic, one of the misconceptions is that people who are autistic lack empathy, but it's not that. It's not that we are missing what's going on within social interactions. It's that we see so much of it that it's hard to distinguish, rather. Like, we can sense everything and we can't really tell what the important things are. So we kind of just tap out after a while because it's a lot of information that we're taking in at once. And for a lot of us, social interaction can be really stressful for that reason. Also, due to the fact that we may not always know how to respond in ways that make other people feel comfortable. And that is something that contributes to sensory overload. Now, if you're not aware, sensory overload occurs when your body is taking in so much information from your surroundings, whether it's from other people, whether it's from the bus you hear coming down the street, or from the fabric of the clothing that you're wearing. So we understand what that is in terms of mental stress. When our minds get overloaded, we understand what it's like to kind of want to tap out in that situation. In terms of sensory regulation, that's what happens to autistic people, and that's what happens to other neurodivergent people as well. Now, just to warn you viewers and listeners out there, I am about to get into some pretty specific psychological terminology and neurological terminology for a second. Just some vocab words for you. So, the different parts of the brain. There's the brain stem, which is your reptilian brain, responsible for arousal regulation, sensations, i.e. sensory elements, your breath, and your heartbeat. And then there's the limbic system, which is referred to by experts oftentimes as the emotional brain. And that's often confused with matters of the heart. That part of your brain controls your emotions, your memories, everything that is central to those elements. And I think the fascinating thing about that part of the brain is that the memories and the emotions are often linked together. But something that I find fascinating is that when the reptilian brain, which is often impacted by trauma, when that part of your brain is ignited, then it can often hinder the emotional brain from doing its job. So when we're in a traumatic experience, or when we're in that fight or flight moment, it's often hard for us to connect with our memories of that instance because another part of our brain was activated, disallowing the other part of our brain to be used in that moment. A similar thing occurs when we are in an emotionally heightened state. You'll find that when someone's in an emotionally heightened state, that they will often look back at that experience and not have specific memories of what actually occurred, or of what they saw or heard or felt. Like, y'all, the brain is a wild thing. The brain is fascinating as it pertains to the reptilian brain or the brain stem. In a lot of mindfulness or meditation practices, you find a lot of focus on the breath, because the part of the brain that encompasses the breath is the brain stem. There was a study that showed that children who had endured trauma had resting heart rates that were higher than children who hadn't. And that's their resting heart rate when they're just sitting there doing nothing. And that just makes a whole lot of sense to me. So, now that you have those vocab words, I just wanted to provide perspective in terms of talking about matters of the heart and talking about the emotional brain in correlation with the heart. The two do inform each other. So I follow this woman on Instagram named Emmy Marie, and she's a trauma coach. And she, in one of her posts, which I'll link in the description of this episode, she referred to 4 ways that trauma affects your relationships. Now, we talked about how trauma lives within the brain and how it manifests itself there. And as self-explanatory as it is, we carry our brains with us everywhere. They're a part of us. They become a part of our relationships. They become a part of how we see the world. They become a part of how we see ourselves. And so I think about Emmy Marie's coachings, and I think about a lot of her practices and how they emphasize focusing on the self before branching out into relationships, because your relationships will often be a reflection of yourself, or how you view yourself. I don't really like when people say, whether they're a guru or not about mental health or about wellness, I don't really like when people say you attract what you are, because I don't believe that. I don't think that people who attract narcissists, I don't think they attract certain personalities because of who they are. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think they attract who they think they are. You attract who you think you are, because you can be the sweetest, kindest, smartest baller out there and attract some mess. Not saying that people are mess, but attracting toxic energy in your life. Not because of who you are, but because of what you put out into the world. Now, if you don't want anything out of life because you don't think you deserve anything out of life, then that's going to show. That's going to exude from you, no question, without any effort. But if you walk around like someone who deserves the life that you want, then that energy is going to come back to you. When you show up in a room with the energy of, I deserve this, I deserve to be here, I am smart enough to be here, I am qualified enough to be here, then people are going to treat you like you are qualified enough to be there. And that's without taking into account oppression, etc. But just in a general sense, people treat you the way that you treat yourself. And that also puts into perspective this fact. If someone mistreats you, it is not your fault. It is not a reflection of who you are. Maybe it's a reflection of the boundaries that you set out or did not set out. Maybe it's a reflection of how you communicated those boundaries or did not communicate them. Maybe it's a reflection of how much you think you deserve. So, Emmy Marie refers to 4 different ways of how trauma impacts relationships. The first way is with trust, and that's trust within yourself, of how you make decisions, of what you have to offer, of what you can accomplish. That's trust in other people, that they will be able to provide in a relationship an environment that is safe for you, that they will be able to meet your needs. It's trust that you will be able to meet their needs. And something fascinating that I found out was I was watching, there's this documentary that I really love called Babies on Netflix. I think it's still on. I think it's about 2 seasons long at this point. But something that I was able to grasp from that series was from an experiment that they did. So basically they had all these parents and their babies involved in an experiment where they would watch the baby from about maybe like 6 months old to 1 year old. And so they would go through the different phases of growth, from the baby stage to the infant stage. And one of the things that one of the researchers pointed out was the concept of love between a child and a caretaker. And it was so juicy, y'all. It was so juicy. And I'm paraphrasing, that trust between a caretaker and a child grows when the baby trusts the caretaker to meet their needs. But not only that, it's also when the caretaker trusts the baby to be able to communicate when a need is not being met. And in a circulatory sense, that the baby will then trust the caretaker to meet the need after the baby has communicated that that need is not being met. And that is when love between the caretaker and the child grows. I was like, ooh, this is a good one. This is a good nugget. Because that makes so much sense within our relationships as adults, as grown people, you know? When we're in a partnership with someone, even when we're in a friendship with someone, we trust that there's a level of communication where if we mess up, or either of us mess up, or either of us is not meeting the other's needs, that will be communicated. And the second that trust goes away, the relationship starts to dissolve. And that makes so much sense. That was such a concrete, beautiful way of putting that, and of being able to make it digestible for me personally. I hope it's useful for you as well. But that was just really eye-opening to me in terms of adult relationships and how communication is so important, and especially communication of boundaries. And when you trust that someone is going to respect that boundary, which is meeting a need, then that is when the relationship grows. And that is when love is truly beginning to form. But when you don't trust that person to A, respect your needs or boundaries, or B, communicate a boundary or a need, then that trust goes away. And trauma often blurs the line. Rather, it oftentimes makes people feel that they don't have a right to express a boundary, or that if they do express a boundary, that it won't be respected. Yeah, I find that to be a common occurrence. Another way that trauma can affect relationships is discernment. So I had to learn discernment because as a neurodivergent person, the way that it manifests itself in my life is growing up, I really didn't understand the concept of friendships or any kind of relationship outside of my family unit. And I really didn't understand how to tell if someone was being kind to me. And I know that that can sound kind of strange, but for a lot of people like me, we can't tell when someone is being kind to us, or when they're using us as the butt of a joke, or when they're making fun of us. And it's behavior that we have to learn over a long period of time, which, yes, as you can imagine, can be traumatizing. You're right. It can be. But yeah, so for a lot of people who have either been used to having their boundaries disrespected, or they weren't allowed to have boundaries in the past, then that level of discernment is gone, because you're like, oh, I'm so used to situations where I'm not being respected. So when someone comes along in my life as an adult and disrespects me, I'm going to be like, oh, it must be a Tuesday. You're not going to think anything wrong with it because you're so used to being treated that way. And honestly, that's how I was used to being treated in friendships. I was so obtuse to what a healthy friendship was that when someone treated me like dirt, I couldn't tell the difference. I couldn't tell. You know, and that's why it's so important to communicate, because what people will often do is they will try weaning someone off them if they don't actually want to spend time with them. But when you have someone in the mix who is used to being treated like that, in what they would have considered a relationship or a friendship, they're not going to be able to tell that you want them to go away. They're going to think this is normal. So because discernment, you know, is a tricky thing to develop for certain people, it can take a long time to actually grow that skill. And a lot of that might actually take some alone time. You know, Miss Pandemic up in here telling us to sit down and hold a mirror up to our faces. Some of us have had to really hone in on what feels right to us and what doesn't feel right, what feels comfortable and what feels like it's crossing a boundary. And a lot of us, when we don't have the space to create that map for ourselves, that guide, then it just never develops. The last two areas within relationships that become compromised when you've endured trauma, or that can become compromised, I've referred to a few times, so I'm just going to glaze over them. Communication and boundaries. With communication, people have different communication styles, And sometimes someone's communication style is a reflection of trauma, and sometimes it's just a reflection of how they communicate naturally. Like for me, I'm very direct, and I prefer for any kind of criticism to come as direct as possible, because I'm just not here for the fluff. I'm not here for the beating around the bush. It's a waste of time. I will often not get it if someone beats around the bush. So I prefer direct communication and specificity. But everybody might not like that. And it might not necessarily be a reflection of trauma. Maybe they like to feel cushioned a little bit. Maybe they like to feel cared for a little bit more. And maybe that's just a reflection of who they are as a person rather than what they've been through. Everyone has different communication styles. And I think that when you're in a trusting relationship, whether it's platonic or not, that you understand that side of the other person, and you can do some give and take pertaining to what feels good to you / natural to you, and what feels good / natural to them. And I say good / natural because oftentimes what we will do as people is we'll say, oh, this feels good to me. What we actually mean is this feels natural. This is what I'm used to. Because what feels good may not always be good for you. The things that have felt good to me were not necessarily good for me. And it really comes into focus when you go through these breakups or friend breakups or what have you, where you're like, was this relationship fruitful or was it just convenient? Did this feel good because I didn't want to be alone, or did this feel good because it was healthy? And I think that a lot of us would look back at previous relationships or friendships in hindsight and be like, oh, no, I was just lonely. No, I needed someone to talk to, and I wasn't comfortable with that someone being myself or my therapist. And I just wanted a person, a body there next to me. And that's okay. That's okay to admit that. That's okay to have had that instinct, because we want to connect. A lot of us as people want to connect in one way or another. And I don't think anyone should be ashamed of that desire to connect. I don't think anyone should be ashamed of that desire to be empathized with and to empathize. It's just a matter of honing in that skill, because it is a skill set to empathize, and honing in that gift, if you will, and placing it properly so that it is not detrimental to our own health and to our trajectory as individuals. And the last one I will glaze over it, boundaries. Knowing your boundaries is in alignment with having discernment. When you can discern that someone is surpassing your boundaries, then that's when the communication comes in. Once you have that cyclical pattern of boundaries, discernment, communication, then that trust begins to form. So the way that I like to organize my palace is as follows. People who are not in the house yet are the people who I meet initially. I get good energy from them. They seem open to me, and that's a great place to start. So people who are in the foyer or in the inside of the front door, those are the people whose values seem to be in alignment with mine, but I have not seen them in practice yet. Then people are the people who are welcomed into the living room, and you can decide to organize your palace this way or not. But the people who belong in the living room are the people who I have seen their values in practice. I haven't necessarily developed a close bond with them. I haven't necessarily revealed anything deeper about myself to them, nor have they to me, but I trust them to be in my living room. I trust that they will not steal anything from my living room. Now, what that translates to is them not being overtly dishonest. So if they say they're going to be somewhere, they're going to be there. They're not lying to you. If they say they want to hang out, they actually want to hang out. You communicate a boundary, they respect that boundary. That's great. But also, these are people who you might not develop a really close relationship with yet. Now, the people who belong in the kitchen are the people who you dine with. Now, the people who you are willing to offer sufficient parts of yourself to, and they are willing to do the same. So you are letting them eat your food. And that is a very intimate thing. Sitting down at a dinner table is a very intimate thing, the way that I see it. And so you are offering up something a little bit more than you would to people who are only allowed in the living room. Now, the people who are allowed upstairs are the people who are the closest to your heart. They are the people who have access to your heart or your bedroom. They can sufficiently impact your emotions if they were to be dishonest with you or if they were to leave. They're the people who you would miss if they left. And it would take some time to recover if they did leave. You would be okay, but there would be some mourning there. Now, you can imagine as you go through the house, as you go through your palace, the number of people you let deeper inside should dwindle. There should be a lot less people in the bedroom and in the office than there are in the foyer or on the front step. And that's by design, because everybody can't come in. Everybody can't know the inner workings of your heart. Everyone can't have access to you like that. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're less empathetic. It doesn't mean that you don't care about them. It means that you have decided that your heart is sacred. And you have decided that access to your emotions is earned. And access to what you have to offer, to your time, to your knowledge, that is earned. You know, the people who you make sacrifices for, they have to work to get to that level. I think for a long time, I was married to the idea that being a caring person meant that you had to give everyone everything at the drop of a hat. I think it was probably like fourth or fifth grade. I was really a pushover and I didn't understand the concept of moderation or of standing up for myself. I didn't know how. I didn't have the language to do so either. And I remember someone saying that I would just give them anything. I remember someone saying that to me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to bend for myself at all, stand up for myself in the slightest. And now I look back and I forgive that person. Of course, I forgive myself for that, as you should. Because again, you shouldn't be ashamed of the empathy that comes naturally to you, and you shouldn't be ashamed of caring about people. But I also understand that there are plenty of people who will take advantage of that, whether I notice it initially or not. And that's why it have to be stages. There have to be mechanisms to protect yourself, not to build up an armor, but to build a palace, because your heart is a palace. It is a sacred, beautiful thing that should be nurtured and treasured by whoever you open it up to. Because if someone has proven themselves to be a thief or to be nasty or dirty, I'm not going to open up my house to them. They're going to tear up my sofa. They're going to try to steal my jewelry from my bedroom. I want to end on this note. What happens when we throw our boundaries to the wayside because we really care about somebody, because we really think we can make a difference in their life? And maybe we can, but how much are we willing to offer up of ourselves? I think that people who consider themselves to be empaths, or people who tend to, I don't really like when people refer to themselves as empaths because it just kind of feels self-righteous. But people who tend to be really empathetic and who are highly sensitive people, rather, I think they are the perfect prey for people who are selfish, who practice selfishness and do not regulate that part of themselves. And because of that, it becomes really difficult if you do not have discernment, if you have not established your boundaries for yourself, and if you don't practice communicating those boundaries. Even, and I've done this, I've practiced communicating my boundaries out loud to myself when there's no one around. I have practiced uttering the words that I would say in front of someone else if a boundary is about to be crossed, or if I want to explain it before things get out of hand. Like, before I go on a date, I make sure that I practice verbalizing out loud what my boundaries are in terms of dating. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you just have to practice it out loud to yourself. What exactly you're going to say if something were to happen that you weren't comfortable with. or if you wanted to get it out there in the open. And here's the thing, if you have been in that situation with someone where they have completely disregarded your boundaries and you're having a hard time letting go of that person because of whatever cycle you're wrapped up in, whatever addiction to that person you're wrapped up in, that kind of addiction that often occurs between people who are empathetic and people who feed into that energy and utilize it for their own personal gain. The way to let go of someone like that, the way to leave that person behind, is to find them completely uninteresting. You don't know what they like to do for fun. You don't care. You don't know how they're feeling right now. You really can't think about it. You don't know what they've been through that made them that way. You can't care. It doesn't matter whether or not they are a good person at their core. Maybe they are. Maybe they are a good person. Maybe they're not. That is not your concern. Your concern is not whether or not the person who has harmed you is a good person. Your concern, and your only concern, is whether or not they are good for you. And that's it. I know it's easier said than done, but it really has to be that cut and dry. And if you can get there, if you can boil it down to, this is my palace, my heart, my mind, my body, my spirit, this is my palace. And anyone who threatens my palace, anyone who threatens its well-being, they have to go. They will not be entertained. I really hope you find the strength and the courage to turn this episode into something tangible for yourself and implement it in your daily life, in your relationships. I really hope that you can do that, because I promise it is worthwhile. I am the poster child for people who let people mistreat them. And I am so glad to say that I've been able to grow from that, and I've become stronger and more outspoken than I've ever been. And I really hope that same journey for you too. Well, that's this episode of Plot Twist Please. Again, please like and subscribe and share, and have a great rest of your day. Stay weird, y'all. Bye.